Welcome back. This is lecture 5 in the series Philosophy for Living. And in this lecture, I'm going to deal with the issue of freedom and responsibility and empowerment. As you probably can recognize by now, that we've spoken about how to examine the condition of your life, how to look at the influences, and how to begin to get a sense of the areas that you want to develop, the the possibilities that are opening up in terms of your future. And we go back to our consistent theme here, which is the Heideggerian idea about the lifeline, whereby you are always found between your past and your future, and the decisions that you make and the events that affect your life in this moment in time will have a dramatic influence on the future that you create. So we have talked about the self-creating, the noble life task, creating a life for yourself, creating and also influencing the character that you are, the person you're becoming. And all of that assumes something. It all assumes that actually you have a faculty for making changes in your life, for influencing the direction. And that faculty is called the will. And freedom is its expression. So freedom is the expression of the will, and the faculty of the will is the human capacity to make choices, to be able to examine alternatives. And Hannah Arendt talks about this as being that she says about the will that no other faculty except language, neither reason nor consciousness, distinguishes us so radically from all other animal species. What she means here is that the faculty of the will frees us from the complete determinism, the complete programming that is given to the animal kingdom. They work in their lives, they live out their lives, they exist their lives completely programmed by their genetic inheritance, and that's how it functions. And human beings, because of our evolution, have developed a capacity to transcend certain aspects of that, and that's the aspect of freedom and will. And it's an essential component of our lives, and we have a responsibility to examine what it means and how do we actually develop it. Again, this course is about personal development. It's about fulfillment and authenticity, and it's about beginning to get more empowerment in your life to live out that life, that unique identity that you have. We've spoken about the fact that that's a rather new idea, and that there are certain societies and cultures whereby it's very, very limited. So we will talk about the limitations of freedom, because it's clear that there are certain situations whereby freedom is extremely limited. Probably the philosopher that's most noted for prizing and championing the idea of freedom is that of Jean-Paul Sartre, who says that, complete freedom and complete responsibility, is this not the very definition of man, humanity? His essay, Existentialism and Humanism, is worth reading. It's a short essay, and it's worth reading just from the point of view of really sort of encouraging us to consider what it means to be free. But as you will see as we go through the lecture, that there are lots of complex pieces to this and lots of aspects of it whereby we need to give some consideration of what it means to be free, what are our limitations to that. So we're talking about freedom then in terms of the capability that you have to influence the changes in your life, to create, to construct, and to influence the constitution of your own identity and the directions that your life is taking. And because it's a human capacity, it's obviously going to be very developed in some people and not developed very well in others. So I like to see the faculty of freedom, the faculty of the will, and freedom is expression, a little bit like physical fitness. you can see that there are some people who are very physically fit, and you wonder why that is. And it's oftentimes because they take care of their welfare. They expand their physical fitness by taking exercises, by going to the gym, which I'm allergic to, and I admire the people who do it. I tried it several times, and I just come out of there kind of more defeated than anything else. But then I don't have a huge high priority on all of that stuff. Um, so we think about that and you think, okay, these people are investing time and energy in developing that fitness. They put themselves through a program of fitness oftentimes. They'll do their weightlifting or their circuit training, or some will just do power walking and they'll walk for miles, and well done them. And then you have lazy people who don't do any of that. And I would consider myself physically a little bit of a sloth, which is that I find the challenge of physical exercise quite difficult. So I try to take care of my diet as best I can. I'm carrying a bit of weight. So you just say, look at me and think, right, all in all, for my age, I'm reasonably healthy, but I'm not as fit as I could be because I haven't invested in it. So freedom's a little bit like that. If you haven't invested in the development of your freedom, then oftentimes you will have less freedom in your life than you could if you'd understood a bit better how to develop it. So let's take a closer look at what freedom is. C.S. Lewis describes that he's a Christian apologist and writes very good stuff in relation to our relationship with God. He's a Christian, and he promotes Christianity in a way that very few. I think he's probably one of the best Christian apologists around in terms of his explanations of what Christianity is about. But he says something about freedom. He says, I would much rather say that every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. And taking your life as a whole with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning the central thing, either one kind of that, which is often joy, peace, knowledge, happiness, fulfillment, power, all of these things, or maybe your choices have led you into areas of loneliness, isolation, pain, a feeling of being entrapped and enslaved. So he's making a point here, which is we make these innumerable choices, and some of them are actually leading us into actual enslavement. So we're making choices to take away our capacity to choose. I like that idea, that progressive peace, and that it's over a long period of time rather than some immediate sort of epiphany or magical dramatic moment, which is quite seductive for some people. They feel that they can get empowerment by going for a weekend workshop on empowerment, and they come out and it's all very exciting. They're emotionally heightened. They've been doing a fire walk, or they're doing something that the facilitators have got you doing to help you to really start believing that you can do, you're a world beater, you can do anything. Usually by the week later, you're probably a little bit poorer and you're oftentimes really back to where you started from, because that's not the way freedom works. So we're going to look at what will help you, because this course is practical as well as philosophical, what will help you expand and develop and enrich your sense of freedom in your life, so that you can begin to make the kind of changes that you're being called upon now by virtue of actually looking at the other areas that you've looked at in this course so far. You've done an awareness, you've done an evaluation, you understand yourself better through these experiences, and now you should be beginning to get some kind of sense of a vision for yourself that you want to pursue. You may not have put the meat on the bones of that, but you now need to know, right, well, what do you do? So the first thing you need to do, I think, is let go or get rid of any sort of habits. That sounds trite, habits, but how you're dealing with the issue of freedom and change at the moment, you need to evaluate that piece. You need to look at what is your attitude to your freedom at the moment. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to be critical of a particular ideology that I consider to be insidious ideology about change, that has taken the world by storm in the last 20 to 30 years. Part of the New Age spirituality, mind, body, spirit movement. Um, and this has to do with a kind of magical thinking called the power of thought. And the reason I want to actually talk a little bit about this is because it creates a passivity. It prevents you from developing your freedom in a way that you need to develop it. Because what it does is it allows you to imagine that you are making changes when you're actually not. So the power of thought is probably best expressed through Rhonda Byrne's book, The Secret, and then all of the spin-offs since that. And there are several sort of scientific ideas, the law of attraction. There's a kind of a bit of corruption of quantum physics mixed in with a bit of magical thinking and a bit of age-old Christian science and that kind of. So it's a mix basically. The law of attraction and the notion of manifesting. So I want to discuss that a little bit in terms of putting it to bed and saying, right, this is not the way to go. Because when we think about freedom, we're talking about how do you engage with life in such a way that you make changes. This is the thing. How do you influence things to shift, to change possibilities? And if you believe that actually your thinking, changing your thinking is going to change the possibilities, then you're actually wrong. It must lead to some kind of action. Now, of course, thinking is important because, we spoke the last 4 lectures we've looked at that. And of course, it's important to imagine and visualize things. But I just want to give you an example here, 1 or 2 examples of the kind of thinking that has been promoted in this work and why that's actually difficult and why it's dangerous for yourself in terms of your life project. And it is a life project, and part of the thing is to see your life as a project, as an ongoing work in progress. There is a period in childhood that some children go through. It's called a magical thinking period, and it's sometimes very upsetting for them because they get this notion that that thinking makes it so, that if they think something, then it's going to come true. And oftentimes that's related to thinking that there are stuff they're afraid of. Now, the adult version of that is a form of an anxiety disorder, and it's a form of obsession compulsive disorder called OCD. It's magical thinking, whereby a person has usually an intrusive thought of something very, very disturbing and distressing, like they want to drown their children. They might have a thought about drowning the children, and then they're terrified by this. And of course, they can't tell anybody about this because everybody will think that they're crazy or that they're terrible people. But they themselves feel extraordinarily guilty. And most of the people who have this type of disorder are usually very sensitive people. They're usually very caring people. And the reason it traps them is that they're the very last person that would harm or do any of the things that they think that they might do. And it's a terrible condition to have. And so they develop certain techniques or rituals to try and keep the thought at bay. Step on a crack, break your mother's back, this kind of stuff. So the other side of this idea of OCD is the power of thought in that new quasi-spiritual thinking, which is thinking makes it so, but it's all about the good stuff. And it's as equally delusional as OCD. So let me take an example from just two examples. One is about the beauty industry. Let's say that you want to lose weight, which is, one of the things that's happening in the world at the moment is there's a pushback against the fact that people who are fat are judged harshly, and I think that's fair. We shouldn't judge people so harshly by virtue of the fact that they're carrying weight. But they themselves may judge themselves harshly, and they may decide to themselves, I would like to lose weight. So that's part of, we say, for some people, a part of their life plan or a part of their project, which is to lose weight because they don't like being overweight. So now we actually bring us into the realm of how do we influence things? How do we change that? Do we have the freedom to do that? And of course, anybody who's been through the whole process of weight loss and dieting realizes that sometimes it's very difficult. But many, many people do lose weight, and that means that it's within the human capacity to do so. Let's look at what this kind of delusional thinking does in relation to that. This is a quotation from The Secret. She says that the most common thought that people hold, and I held it too, is that food was responsible for my weight gain. That is a belief that does not serve you, and in my mind now is complete balderdash. Food is not responsible for putting on weight. It is your thought that food is responsible for putting on weight that actually has food put on weight. Remember, thoughts are primary cause of everything, and the rest is effects from those thoughts. Think perfect thoughts, and the result must be perfect weight. Let go all those limiting thoughts. Food cannot cause you to put on weight unless you think it can. So now there we are with thinking makes it so. So let's go back to the question of freedom again. So what this is telling you is that all you need to do in order to influence this piece of your life, which is to lose some weight, is to think about it. Let go the limiting thoughts. Food cannot cause you to put on weight unless you think it can. So this is a form of dumbing down. It's extraordinary, and it's actually accepted by millions of people. Now, it's a very easy out because that means that, you don't really have to do the hard work of actually taking on the problem of weight loss. An even more insidious version of this relates to disease and illness. How do we manage our illness? Because, as we will see in one of my other courses, the issue of suffering will be dealt with, and physical suffering and all that goes with that. And you say to yourself, well, okay, how do we deal with the problem of suffering, and how do we deal with when we get ill? What's that about? So let's say, what does this particular view of freedom, because again, the reason I'm saying this has got to do with freedom, because it's got to do with how do we make the changes? How do we influence the direction? Here's the solution. It's on page 128. Our physiology creates disease to give us feedback, to let us know that we have an imbalanced perspective, or we are not being loving or grateful. And when a person has manifested a disease in the body temple, or some kind of discomfort in their life, it cannot be turned around through the power of right thinking. Absolutely yes. Your disease can be turned around through the power of right thinking. So again, we're back to a situation, say, right, if you're ill, this has got all kinds of implications. The first implication is that disease is your body giving you feedback that you've had the wrong attitude. Maybe you weren't being loving enough or grateful enough. So what does that mean? That means that if you have a disease, you've caused it. Your attitude is the problem. Now, I've mentioned Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Smile or Die, and it's a wonderful story because it has to do with the effect that this kind of thinking can have and this kind of ideology can have on people who are suffering, because it shames them and they're afraid to talk about their grief, their loss. People who have cancer, for example, who buy into, or who are in a group who buy into this, they're afraid to say how angry they are because they're told the anger is feeding the cancer. This is dreadful stuff. It's inhumane. But more importantly, it is inhumane, but more importantly, it's rubbish. It's wrong. This is not how people change. This is not how it works. So in order to sometimes to deal with a concept that I'm dealing with here about freedom, one of the things you've got to get rid of or leave is you've got to push it, to let go of ideologies or belief systems that actually get in your way in terms of developing your sense of freedom. Now, what this world, this pseudo-scientific world of the power of thought, what it is using as its fundamental thing is the power of visualization. Now, we have spoken a bit about this already. The faculty of imagination is a human faculty. And imagination is a faculty by which we can create in our mind's eye a vision or a picture of how we might want something to be. And that is its limit. That is fantastic. That is wonderful. Go for it. I'm not saying we should not use our imagination or our visualization to help us to understand the path that we might need to go to. That oftentimes maybe the outcome we seek. We may not even know the path yet. We might just know the outcome we seek. We might want an outcome which is a better relationship with our spouse or our partner. We want a better relationship with our children. We would like to have a bit more money in the bank. We would like to feel that we're actually doing something important. There's so many different aspects of this, our lives that we look at, and our imagination helps us to get that picture. And we've already done this in our last session, which is looking at creating in our mind's eye those things. That's it. Now, none of that will actually make it happen. That simply tells you. Like if I said I would love to go for a walk along the beach in Clifton, but on a sunny day, and I sit in my office and I imagine myself doing that, I could still be in my office a year later and it won't have happened. Why? I've imagined it, I can see it, but I haven't done anything about it. So this philosophy, and because it's pseudo-spiritual, is what it's doing is it's saying that, and this is where the pseudoscience comes in, that your thoughts are actually having some effect on the universe. Now, this is an extraordinarily arrogant idea. That the planetary systems are turning. And if I put out a positive thought out to the universe in some way is going to send back a positive energy, because it's all about energy to me. Now, even a grade school child understands that the principles of magnetism are that positive energy attracts negative energy. That's the way it works. Magnetic fields work by positive, negative, rather than positive, positive. So just to take the science then. Now, you might say to me, well, what's the difference between that and praying to God? Well, it's very simple. If I actually wanted, if my car broke down, and I rang my sister or my brother or a friend and said, look, can you help me out here? Will you come and collect me? And I need to ring a pickup truck or whatever to take the car to the garage. I would be engaging with somebody else. I would be asking them to do something and they could come along and do it for me. They are an agent of change and they come and they do it and they help me out. And for people who have strong religious conviction, they believe that God is like that. God is actually is a being with the capacity to change and to affect the practical day-to-day parts of their lives. And they ask God to do that and God does it. This is a different thing. This is something to do with magnetism and universal energy forces and all that. It just has a different feel to it. So what I'm saying to you is if you're depending on this type of thinking as a means of actually exercising freedom and influencing your life, you're going to be in trouble. You need to stop doing that. I have seen so many people whose lives have been badly damaged by that kind of thinking. People who, in business, for example, who bought into this, people even I think Stephen Jobs, I'm not sure, but I have a feeling that Stephen Jobs refused a lot of orthodox treatment because some of this type of beliefs, and there are many who say that he could have actually saved his own life if he had done that. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but you know, it's maybe it's an urban legend. I don't know. But be careful because it's passive. It doesn't make things happen. Thinking does not make it so. You might argue with me and say, well, of course thinking makes it so because you have to. No, thinking is part of making it so. Remember when I said, everything in the world has been created twice, one in the imagination and then in the practical reality of the world. The first piece is the imagination. Without the second piece, it doesn't work. We know that children daydream, and that's what we're talking about here. And oftentimes children are daydreamers because they can't really influence their environment that much. Okay, so let's put that there. So that's letting go something that could be in the way of you exercising and expanding your freedom. Now, the second thing we need to look at is the fear of freedom. What's that about? You would think that if I said to you, look, this is the amazing thing, you have a faculty of the will. And what that means, of course, is that if you have a faculty of the will, you're going to need to acknowledge, as C.S. Lewis does, that after a long life making innumerable choices, that we are at least partially responsible for the condition our lives are in. And sometimes that brings fear with it. There's a really good story in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, which highlights this idea of the fear of freedom, what it means for people to be free. He gives an example of a period during the Spanish Inquisition. This section of Brothers Karamazov is called The Grand Inquisitor, and you could probably get a PDF of it online. It's worth reading. The Grand Inquisitor during the Inquisition is the chief inquisitor, and the inquisitors were given the job by the church to root out heresy, to find out who it's the ultimate form of thought crime, I suppose. Which brings it back up into the modern world of Orwell's 1984. Check your thinking, the thought police. Well, the Inquisition was like a form of the thought police. There's a lot of online thought police available now. They actually, if you think something they don't agree with, then you're not allowed to think it. And we're heading into a very, very difficult and insidious and pernicious time in terms of trying to control how people's beliefs about certain things. If you don't agree with their particular ideology, you'll be cancelled, or you'll be punished, or you'll be, or the vitriol and hatred will be sent your way. So that aside, I would say to you, right, what is this about? So the Grand Inquisitor anyway is there, and that's his job, and he's a 90-year-old cardinal, and Jesus appears in the village, and people are looking at him because they have a very strong sense of Christ, because this was the height of the Catholic power of the Catholic Church. He begins to go around the village and begins to minister to the people the way he did in the stories of the New Testament. And he heals the sick, and eventually he raises this girl, very similar kind of story as the one in the Gospel, where this girl, there's a funeral, and the girl's body's been brought into the church, and the Christ figure comes and lays his hands on her, and she is resurrected from the dead. And people are so excited, and they're so full of joy, and they're so full of, they're all full of wonder. Is this him? Is it he? Of course. The Grand Inquisitor is there, and he looks on at this, and he's very upset about it and worried about it, and he has Jesus arrested, and he takes him into the prison. And the story goes then, the Grand Inquisition takes place, and he explains to Christ, to the Christ figure, that that he really shouldn't be doing what he's doing, because things are much better now than they were back then, that the church has taken over. And his particular complaint to Jesus is, he said, you misunderstood your flock. You didn't understand how pathetic they are. He said, in the temptation in the desert, when you were being asked, to turn the stones into bread and give it to the people, you refused. You said, man shall not live by bread alone, but you should have turned the stones into bread. You would have been much better off had you done that, because the people do want the bread. And similarly, the other temptations to throw yourself off the mud and let the angels carry you up. Why didn't you do that? Because if you did that, people would have really, really got you, and they would have really adored you even more so, and you wouldn't have been crucified. So all of this has to do then, he says, with your belief that the people, that the flock, that you believed that they had more integrity, and that they wanted freedom of choice, freedom to believe what they needed to believe, and that you trusted them. And he said, you really shouldn't have done that. He says, I swear man is weaker and baser by nature than thou hast believed him. By showing him so much respect, thou didst, as it were, cease to feel for him, for thou didst ask far too much from him. So then he goes on to explain that the church is taking care of all of that now. there's no need for people now to worry about any of it, because the church is going to give them what they need. And the most important thing that the church gives them is that they take away their fear of freedom. They take away their freedom from them, because they're too upset. Freedom is too heavy a burden for people to carry. He said, all again in the name of freedom. I tell thee that man is tormented by no greater anxiety than to find someone quickly to hand over that gift of freedom with which the ill-fated creature is born. Didst thou forget that man prefers peace and even death to freedom of choice in the knowledge of good and evil? Nothing is more seductive for a man than his freedom of conscience, but nothing is a greater cause of suffering. So Dostoevsky here is trying to tell us that if we have freedom, we have responsibility. It's a huge burden. It's too big a task. Imagine that idea that that our choices, have to look inside our hearts to make these choices. Isn't it so much easier to actually let somebody else do that for us? So the fear of freedom. So freedom doesn't come without a cost, and the cost of that is responsibility. Now, why is that such a difficulty? Well, there's a couple of reasons why we fear freedom. We're going to go into that. One is that piece, which is that we don't want to take responsibility. That's a kind of form of victimhood. Sometimes people prefer the gains of being victim to avoid responsibility. They prefer to believe that it's not any of their fault, that they're not responsible. Because if they've made a bags of it, if they've actually created the conditions in their lives that are terrible, they don't want to look at that. It's too painful. Say, I've done it, I've made this mistake. We fear the guilt sometimes. This is called existential guilt. And we will look more closely at existential guilt in a few sessions I'm going to do on existential therapy. But the guilt of about our existence. Is this what we've done with our lives? Caroline Miss is a therapist, and she says about victimhood, people who seem to enjoy and celebrate almost their victimhood. And we've met people like this, that, no matter what goes on in their lives, they will complain about it. And it's always somebody else's fault. They're avoiding responsibility. So freedom brings responsibility. If you want to avoid responsibility, then you must actually avoid freedom. She says, although the state of mind is sad, self-defeating and defeatist, some people derive great power in maintaining it because it gives them permission to lead a life of minimum expectation and limited responsibility. It allows them to lean on others for assistance and to play on their guilt to keep that assistance coming. They speak regretfully or bitterly about creative goals that cannot be accomplished now or ever because of their history of emotional or physical abuse. They seek out a support system that gives them a social comfort zone, one that remains sympathetic to their woundedness without ever challenging them to put it behind them. Since nothing is expected of the wounded personality, they can never fail. So what she is saying here, and she's reflecting specifically on people who are using their emotional history of abuse, for example, or destruction or abandonment or whatever, that they're using their woundedness as an excuse to not grow. But there's a broader part of that. People who haven't necessarily had those kind of traumatic effects or those traumatic incidences that have harmed them in that way. There's a whole other cohort of people who would prefer to see that that they were oppressed. Maybe in society they were oppressed by something. Maybe they feel they didn't get enough opportunities, or that there was too much poverty in their history, or they didn't get this or they didn't get this, and they spend their time looking at the things they didn't get rather than the ways that they failed to actually work with the things that they did have. So there's a comfort zone there, or as a friend of mine says, it's actually a discomfort zone. But either way, it's that piece. So the gains of victimhood. So when you see somebody, and maybe you've been at this yourself, who is, we'll say, indulging or in that self-pity aspect, and they don't seem to want to make the changes, it's because there's a comfort in that, because you can avoid responsibility. It's nobody else, it's everybody else's fault, and you don't have to confront yourself. the confrontation with the self can be difficult. So that's one really important aspect of the fear of freedom, is it brings you into a confrontation with yourself. And Dostoevsky is saying that's way too much for some people. Much better to have the church take care of that. That's within the Christian tradition. Caroline Myss is looking at it in terms of the way that people actually can become just passive and unresponsive to actually making changes, and that the comfort is in blame. So watch out for blame. Blame is a toxic piece. Another reason why people struggle, or how people struggle with freedom, is that they have a lack of faith. And I don't mean this now in terms of a lack of faith in God. They have a lack of faith in their capacity to change, to influence. And the most important part of that in relation to psychology has been the development of a theory called learned helplessness. It's based on the work of Martin Seligman back in the 60s and 70s. His experiments using dogs, which would never be allowed now, because back in those days, people did things that, you look back at now and say, gosh, like in every epoch, you look back and you say what was acceptable back then is not acceptable now, from slavery right up to the mistreatment of animals in experimentations, child labour, look at photographs of children smoking at 7 years of age outside a sweatshop in London. I think, wow, So our history, as we said in our earlier sessions, you look back and you think, gosh, how privileged are we today in the West? It's still going on in other parts of the world, but this is where we are. But learned helplessness, I'll give you just a quick summary. Discover that if you took a dog and you put a dog into a cage and you put a line down the middle of the cage floor, and the dog was on one side and got an electric shock very quickly and didn't get shocked on the other side, very quickly that dog would actually jump to the other side where he knew he wouldn't be shocked. Simple. He learned how to avoid getting shocked. Now there's all kinds of complex versions of this, but the upshot of it all anyway is that eventually, if a dog actually got to a point where no matter what he did, it wouldn't avoid the shocks, he just actually stopped functioning. He just lay down in the cage. And even when they opened the cage door, he wouldn't get out. Why is that? Because he learned that nothing he did could change the outcome. And so when the dog had been shocked in such a way that no matter what he did would change the outcome, and then when they changed the system so that if he did move to the other side of the cage, he wouldn't be shocked, the dog still didn't move. So he had lost the capacity to and the connection between what's called the response outcome, that his response is going to affect the outcome. Why is this important? This is important because sometimes a person growing up in a society, in a family, in a society, maybe you, maybe me, whatever, we can have experiences where nothing we do is affecting the outcome of our lives. And children can learn that very early on in life. They can learn to believe that nothing they do makes any difference. So learned helplessness is important because it has to do with learning that there's an expectation. Because most of us, when we make an action, we're expecting it to make a difference. And in the bigger questions of our lives, when we look at stuff, we say, right, nothing I do is going to make a difference. So you may have some of that going on. You may have said to yourself, well, I tried this and I tried that and it didn't work. And you become negative and pessimistic, and you lose faith or lose trust that whatever you're doing isn't going to make a difference. And some people will say, well, that's the whole thing about an oppressive society, is that it doesn't make any difference, that people actually go through the hoops and that our society is oppressing groups of people, and no matter what they do, it doesn't make any difference. I do not believe that's true. I believe there's enough examples of people who actually overcome and triumph over adversity to tell us that what we do does make a difference. And I'm just going back to Nietzsche again to think about what he's saying about, that the fear of rejection is another one. So Nietzsche looks at rejection. So we've got the victimhood, which is blame. The belief that nothing you do makes any difference. These are two huge blocks to your freedom. The third is the fear of rejection. And rejection is a deeply painful experience for most people. We're actually designed to love and to be loved and to make attachments to people and to feel valued by people. That's hugely important. And for some people, one of the things that makes them fear their freedom is the fear that to make a choice that would disappoint somebody else will lead to rejection, and that just feels like just too much. And Nietzsche captures this in that quotation that I gave in our last lecture. He said, the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. In other words, the acceptance of the group acceptance. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened. So loneliness and fear, this is the fear of rejection. Thinking, gosh, how can I cope with that? If I say this, if I decide that I want to work part-time and not provide as much money for the situation and go to college and do something, everybody's going to be upset with me if I do that. No, we're talking about responsibility, being able to recognize the consequences of our behavior and all the rest of that. But sometimes it's just that you're disappointing somebody. It's their disappointment with you if you do something that actually means something important for you. And if you make choices based on the idea that you can't use your freedom to influence the life you want to live because of somebody else, then they're the ones who are controlling your life. Now you have become enslaved. That's a form of slavery. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. What an amazing line. Worth thinking about. No price is too high for the privilege of owning yourself. So the fear of rejection, and to get help with that, sometimes you may need to talk to a counselor, a therapist, or you may need to talk to a friend to get support, because sometimes we need support. We all have feet of clay and we're all fragile creatures. So fear of rejection is a big one. But if you let it determine who you're going to become, you've given away your freedom. Another one is pride. Now that's an interesting one. Pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. I like this notion of the 7 deadly sins. Having grown up as a Catholic, I think that there was great wisdom in some of the teachings of the church, which is that they identified the kind of things, they call it sins, sins against God, and that we don't even have to, but sin is an interesting one, a defect, one of the 7 great defects. Human defects that lead us into all kinds of trouble. If we see sin like that, it's very helpful. So the sin of pride, basically, one of the 7 deadly sins. Let's look at how pride would affect us in relation to the expression of our freedom. Well, the obvious one is the fear of failure. See, that's the piece, or the fear of embarrassment. Embarrassing ourselves. We won't take a risk because we don't want to embarrass ourselves. But the bigger one is the fear of failure. I won't try it in case I fail. I had a friend in college. He was extraordinarily intelligent and really, I thought, a really brilliant mind. But he was a mess, as we all were, I think, back then. Insecure, all the stuff that we had coming through a childhood of the 50s and 60s in Ireland really left you very badly equipped to deal with adulthood. But he was very proud. He was very proud. And I think I was too insecure to be proud at that time. But his thing was, I knew he could get a first class honours. He got first class honours in his first year exams. But the second year he started to slip because he just started to mess around and did some drugs. And just, he was a bit of a mess emotionally at the time. And he didn't do much and he didn't go through his lectures. But rather than actually do an exam and just get a pass and then go on to the next year and give himself a little bit of hope that he could maybe pick up the pieces the following year. He couldn't tolerate the idea that he would only pass his exams, so he didn't do the exams because he was too proud and he was afraid of failure. And in his eyes, to not get a first class honours was a failure, and to just pass made him actually just very ordinary, like everybody else. That had a profound influence on the direction of his life, because his path to a career that would have been very different was gone. And he never really picked up those pieces again. Now, that may be as a result of other things and all the rest of that. I don't want to go into any of those details. But there was a decision based on the fear of failure being the thing that stopped him from actually making that choice. The pride prevented him from doing something. So it influenced his freedom. He made a choice, but that choice led him away from something that could have been extremely important to his life. So there are many reasons and there are many things that can get in the way of our freedom. And that's part of our job, is first of all to look to get an understanding of those and to be able to push them to one side and say, right, I can see those areas where I'm losing my freedom, where I am enslaving myself. Because we go back to C.S. Lewis's thing, the part of you that's making the decision, is it leading you to further enslavement? And we talked about Herbert Marcuse talking about the administered life, contented enslavement. Have you created by all your decisions something that you find yourself now in your life, by virtue of the use of your freedom, that you have less freedom? So how do you turn that around? And then the other is complacency, of course, the idea that if it's not broken, there's no need to fix it, that this is a personal development course. It's very interesting to learn the philosophy and psychology of it all and all the rest of that, but I'm actually not that interested in making any changes because I'm content where I am. And that's fine. It's not my job to say you should do it any different. That's your responsibility. But if you say to me, well, I expect to be in this condition in 5 years' time, but I'm not going to do anything about it now, I can guarantee you that it's not going to happen, because you're not going to make it happen. If you don't make it happen, it won't happen. So how do you turn this faculty around? That's complacency, and we've heard about it in terms of like the boiling frog, basically, the frog falls asleep, you put the frog in the cold water, you turn on the water, and the frog will actually fall asleep before he boils. It turns out that that's actually not true. It's kind of a metaphor for that seductive sleepiness, sleepwalking your way through life. But it turns out that if you actually put a frog in boiling water or in cold water and turn up the heat, the frog will get out. Anyway, it's just a metaphor. So turning around, strengthening the faculty of your will. Remember the metaphor of the physical muscle, strengthening that faculty. You have a faculty called your will, and you have some imagery from where our last session as to where you want to go. Now you look at, well, what do you need? Well, the first is to recognize your limitations. You need to be realistic about this. That's a very important. Say, right, where are you stuck? You think, right, okay, where am I stuck? And then you're able to consider the areas you're stuck and the areas that you can change. So there are some limitations that you're not really going to be able to change. So if you've got a vision of yourself that requires a fundamental change that is impossible, you need to make change to the picture. Like, as I said to you, my physical being, if I had a great dream to become a basketball player, I would have had to change that dream, because that's not something that's immutable. So recognizing your limitations, some of them are immutable, and some of them are simply faulty learning, oftentimes through your childhood experience. Now, here's an interesting thing in relation to freedom, because we can go back to Viktor Frankl, and he recognizes that there are some things we can't change. And of course, the serenity prayer is very interesting. God, give me, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. The acceptance of the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's from Karl Barth, I think, the theologian, and I think it's a wonderful reference. The other one that I would give you here is that Frankel's dictum, as a result of his experience in the camps and watching how people cope with interminable suffering. And He said everything can be taken away from a person, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So there are aspects of yourself and your condition in life that you're not going to be able to change. There are certain aspects of that, and this is where the silliness of that quasi spiritual stuff is really, really off, because it's very important to find a way to actually cope with the things you cannot change. And what Frankl helps us to do there is we look at what is our attitude to it. Is our attitude one of resentment and bitterness and anger? And does that fester, and does it prevent us from being able to have joy in other areas of our life? Or does it trap us further into a feeling of victimhood? So watch out for that. So that's the self-awareness there, the self-examination. What is the attitude I have towards this condition of my life? And how is that affecting how I'm living the other aspects of my life? So considering the areas that you can change and distinguishing those who cannot, where you cannot make those changes, and then applying Frankl's dictum can bring you some peace of mind about that and free you up your emotional energy to do things in the other areas that you can change. The second is to take responsibility. We know that one of the aspects of avoiding freedom is to avoid responsibility. Now, what does it mean to take responsibility? Taking responsibility means that when you make a decision, whatever decision you make in any day of your life, I'm not talking about big decisions now. Oh, I'm going to get married, that's a big decision, or I'm going to move my job. It could be very, very small, minor day-to-day decisions. Ask the question, how does this decision or action affect my life plan? How does it affect? Is it getting me closer to the person that I want to become, or is it actually going to lessen my freedom? A simple thing might be like, will I change my car? My car might be working quite well, but there's a lot of pressure because people like status. They like to look and have a nicer car, whatever, and say, right, it'll cost me an extra 10 grand. I can change the car and I can do all this stuff. But I really, really, really did want to do that advanced course in photography and buy a camera because I love photography and a camera, and say, right, okay. Now we're in a situation where you're making a decision. What can help you make your decision? Does the car help you to get further along the path that you need to go? Does that 10,000 that you need to put into that, does that bring you closer to the goal that you want or not? And so when you, and that's a big enough decision too, because that's 10 grand, but it could be, will I spend 2 hours scrolling my Facebook feed and letting the algorithm that's actually triggering my serotonin by putting in these tiny little micro shifts to give me something to keep me on the screen long enough? Or will I read that chapter in Dostoevsky to help me to understand freedom? What will I do with that piece? That's a little decision, tiny decision, but it's all the tiny decisions that end up to the big picture. Recognize that there's two sides to freedom. Freedom to and freedom from. So when we look at our freedom, we're not just thinking about being the action of actually the proactive active bit of saying, I need to do this in order to get there. Sometimes it's also, I need to stop doing this, I need to leave this situation. So making decisions about the difference between freedom to and freedom from. And oftentimes, the first piece will be freedom from, because if you feel that your freedom, your will, your freedom in life is largely contained, or you're in chains in some form of enslavement, in debt, or in a relationship, controlling relationship where you feel completely bound up, or feeling trapped in a dead-end job that you can't get out of, then the freedom to is really not as important at that point. Because the resources are being sucked out of you, and therefore you have to try and find a way to help yourself to get to leave, to get out. And of course, I keep going back to why the Shawshank Redemption, that movie, is so powerful, because it's a rock hammer. If you look at the idea of the rock hammer, and he takes the rock hammer and day in and day out he takes a little bit more, digs a little bit more out of the tunnel. And the metaphor is very, very useful. And of course, you recognize he has to swim through all the shit to get out the other side. So leaving can be difficult. But if you set your mind to it, then you can make a plan. So leaving may be the first step. Escape, I mean, when he escapes from the prison that he's in, his world opens up. But that world is not available to him until he can get out of the cell that he's in. So when you think about your freedom, you may need to look and say, what are causing me to feel trapped in my life? And how did I get there? And how do I need to make that change? And of course, you will be tempted to say no, because rejection going to hurt somebody's feelings, or the job, or you're going to get it socially, people are going to look at you and say that's daft or whatever. And this needs to be done with responsibility, because responsibility is about the consequences. And you see, they say, no, it's not true that you choose the act, you choose the consequences, because sometimes the consequences have nothing to do with the act. If I choose to cross the road to actually meet my friend, and I'm in a hurry, and I just run across to meet my friend, and I get hit by a truck, the consequences of me being hit by the truck had nothing to do with my intention to meet my friend. So we need to be a little bit careful again about these platitudes that are out there in the self-help world. No. But you do need to be mindful of consequence when you make actions. So that's the decision, making decisions, the freedom to, freedom from. Sometimes the freedom from is your first port of call. And making that decision about freedom from, you need to be strategic. You need to think about it. You need to look at how you can do that and what resources you need. The fourth thing I would say to you is to feed the white dog. This comes from a parable that's out there, and it was the famous evangelical preacher, oh gosh, what's his name? It comes from him anyway, because people have said it comes in an ancient or an old Indian story, Native American story or whatever. It's not. It came from, it's much more recent than that. The idea of the person comes into town with a black dog and a white dog. And then he gambles, and people can bet on, he gets the dogs to fight, and he says which of the dogs, and people gamble on which they think. Will it be the white dog that win? Will it be the black dog that wins? The person who owns the dog always wins, because he always knows which dog is going to win. So after he earns his money and everything, it's gone on for a couple of weeks, somebody comes along and says to him, how do you know? How do you know which dog is going to win? Clearly, you always win the bet. He said, it's because I know which one I'm feeding. And I think feeding the white dog, if we take the white dog as being the metaphor for your freedom, and the black dog being the metaphor for your enslavement, what do you do to feed the white dog? What are you doing to nourish your freedom, to continue your path? We've talked about the things you need to do, educating yourself, learning, doing the analysis that we've done, and nurturing your faith and your belief that you can create a better life for yourself. And as a result of that, improve your authenticity and your fulfillment, and be kinder and better to other people. See your life as a work in progress. It's not all going to happen in a week. Life is a work in progress. You're going to have to continue. This is a lifelong program. Personal development means that you continue to grow. And we've talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we've looked at, what it means to self-actualize. And so you don't have to rush it, but you do need to take responsibility to see it in terms of a lifelong progress. And also I would say then, gather your resources. What are your resources for the journey, as they say? What do you need? Your mental, physical, material and spiritual resources. If you waste resources, you won't have them there for you when you need them in order to do that next step that you need on your plan. And everybody's life has a different plan. It's a unique, as we said earlier on, you're a unique human being, unique in your temperament, unique in your genetics, unique in so many ways, and unique in your life experience. And so your plan will be maybe different, of course, than mine, and what I want to achieve in my life and how I would see living an authentic life might be somewhat different. I like to see this as like basically the recipe in a cake. If you want to make a fruit cake, you're going to have fruit, and you've got eggs and sugar and all of that. If you want to make a sponge cake, you're going to have something else. And if you want to make an apple tart, you want something else. The ingredients are different. That's, I suppose, what I'd be saying. Look at what ingredients you need, and have conversations with people that can help you and that are on your side. That's one of your resources, of course, is friendship. And it's also sometimes helpful to talk to somebody, like a therapist or sometimes, but with this, but using this as a frame, it's a very good, useful thing to do to clarify, to plan. Okay, so that's freedom. That's now we say to yourself, those are the things you need to be looking at, you need to be evaluating, you need to be thinking about, and then we need to do the next bit. So, well, what's the picture like that you want to get to, and that's going to be the story of our next session. Our next session is going to look at meaning and purpose in life, and what does it mean to have a passion for something. How does that work, and how does that fit with our spiritual growth? And then that template of this course, the 6 lectures, give you a framework for working on your life. But then you apply it to things. You apply it to relationships. You apply it to suffering. You apply it to vocation. You apply it to work. You apply it to these things. And so I will be spending some time giving some lectures on each of those areas as well, so you can look, and particularly the one on relationships, because we really haven't looked at relationships, and they're an extraordinarily important part of our lives. So we'll be doing that in another course. So our next lecture will be on meaning and purpose in life. In the meantime, take care of yourself.